Identify the incorrect statement. Option A says, the 70s saw debate on the mechanisms and necessities of the development of an altered economic infrastructure of the world nations. This is quite true. This is correct according to the passage. We see this from the first paragraph, especially in this line. Slogans which had animated the 1970s discussions on the new international economic order kept creeping back to the forefront. In the 1970s, thus, there were discussions on the creation of a new international economic order and the mechanisms and necessities that is inherent in the promises that the North had made, which are mentioned in the second and the third paragraphs. We can see that in the third paragraph here. It is mentioned, the spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to come up with $125 billion of yearly assistance to fulfill its long overdue promise of allocating 0.7% of its GNP to development aid to provide clean technologies or access to bio-industrial patents. So here we are talking about the promises that the North had made. Again, there is a reference to the promises, and these promises so far till the present round being unfulfilled in the second paragraph. Consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. So we find that, yes, these demands were the demands from 1970s. They were unfulfilled from the 1970 round. Those were unfulfilled. But that said, there was debate on the mechanisms and necessities of the development of an altered economic infrastructure or a new international economic order. That's what we are talking about. That was there. Such a discussion was there. So this is true according to the passage. A is incorrect. Option B says the 80s was characterized by lost opportunities in realizing the fatal flaw in assumptions made in the 70s and repairing the damage. This is also true. We can see this from the third paragraph again. We've seen how there were promises made. We've already checked that reference. There were promises made by the North in 1970s and till the 1990s, one could say, because we are talking about the 1991 Beijing Declaration here. So this present round is supposed to be set in the 90s, around the 90s, or around the year 1990, that is, at least. We see that before this time, the North had not fulfilled the promises that it had made. At present, the North is willing to fulfill those promises. So the 80s was characterized by lost opportunities that we can see here. It was along these lines that they succeeded after the lost decade of the 1980s in putting back the North-South division squarely on the international agenda. The spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to fulfill its promises. So we see that the 80s was characterized by lost opportunities, almost a direct reference in lost decade of the 1980s, in realizing the fatal flaw in assumptions made in the 70s and repairing the damage. In other words, the promises made in the 70s and why those promises were not fulfilled. So these were not fulfilled, as we see from this reference here, the lost decade mentioned here. These promises were not fulfilled till after the 80s, or at least through the 80s. And so the 80s was characterized by lost opportunities. Quite correct again. B is not a valid answer. Option C tells us the North hopped onto the bandwagon of development being an economic imperative of growing nations despite environmental snags. Now, this is quite incorrect. In many ways, this is contradictory to the passage. First off, we see the reference in the first and the second paragraph. The first paragraph establishes the two perspectives. We see it here. While the northern countries' main concern was about nature, the South, in the wrap-up to the conference, managed to highlight the question of justice. In fact, during the debate leading to the UNCD, attentive spectators wondered, Slogans which had animated the 1970s discussions on the new international economic order kept creeping back to the forefront. In all of this, we can find that there are references to, and in fact, a direct reference to the main concern of the northern countries, or the North as such, as we are referring to it, being that of nature, of ecological preservation, while the South, in the question of justice, is actually talking about development. Development is what we are talking about here. And we can see that from the last statement of the first paragraph and the second paragraph in general. So already in the June 1991 Beijing Declaration of the Group of 77, the point was made clearly and bluntly. This is a point that is referring to the South. Let's not forget, the previous line says, the South, deeply hurt by the breakdown of development illusions. So you see, it is already visible here that the issue of development, that is a key concern of the South, not the North. The North is more concerned about nature. So the South launched demands for further rounds of development. Already in the June 1991 session, the point was made clearly and bluntly. Environmental problems cannot be dealt with separately. They must be linked to the development process, bringing the environmental concerns in line with the imperatives of economic growth and development. In this context, the right to development for the developing countries must be fully recognized. So we find that this entire aspect, the bandwagon of development and economic imperative of growing nations, developing countries, etc., despite environmental snags, this entire part of this option, this relates to the South, not the North. While the option talks about the North, and despite environmental snags, again, logically speaking, is a point of view, is a stance that the North would never take, because as we have seen again and again, that the North was much more concerned about nature, not about development, not so much about development. We can see multiple references to this. One reference is here. We've seen it already. Another reference can be seen in the second paragraph. After the South's years of uneasiness in dealing with the environmental concerns raised by the North, the plot for Rio had finally thickened, since the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons. Consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. So repeatedly, we see that the North is concerned about the environmental. So despite environmental snags, the North would do anything at all that is illogical. And then all that is mentioned here, that entire thing relates to the South, not to the North at all. So this statement is a severe distortion, and a part of this is contradictory to the passage. So C is definitely a valid choice. Option D says, the ideological standoff between South and North resulted in a déjà vu situation at the recent UNCED. This is quite correct. We can see this from the first paragraph. The UNCED process unfolded against a background of 40 years of post-war history. We have seen the positions that the North and the South have taken. While the northern countries' main concern was about nature, the South, in the wrap-up to the conference, managed to highlight the question of justice. In fact, during the debate, now this is the key statement here, key reference here, during the debate leading up to the UNCED, attentive spectators wondered if they had not seen it all before. So it was something so common to the previous rounds that attentive spectators, they wondered if they had not seen it all before. They'd almost seen the entire thing before, the entire play out of the current round of UNCED, which has the North with the main concern for nature and South demanding justice and development. So this is something where the ideological standoff, the argument, the struggle between, or the disagreement between the South and the North, which was ideological, yes, definitely, it resulted in a déjà vu situation. A déjà vu situation, this is an uncommon phrase, but, well, fans of The Matrix would recognize this. But a déjà vu situation is or rather a deja vu, is a situation where you feel as if you've seen something or you've felt something or you've been through something previously. So when you feel that you've done this before, exactly this thing has happened to you before, exactly this very thing has been told to you before, then you say, oh, deja vu. So deja vu is a situation where you feel that something like the present situation or like the present instance or occurrence has something exactly like that has already happened. So we see that it is something that had already happened before. So this basically repeats the whole point of the debate between nature and economy, nature and development again. And it also brings the old aspects, the old discussions to the forefront. Again, we've seen the reference to that. Slogans which had animated the 1970s discussions on the new international economic order kept creeping back to the forefront. So a deja vu situation can definitely be justified. This is a correct statement. D is not a valid choice. The correct answer is option C.